Hi, I'm Mark Krikorian, Executive Director of the Center for Immigration Studies.
And I'm Sister Simone Campbell, the Executive Director of Network, a National Catholic Social Justice Lobby.
So, Simone, we're supposed to talk about immigration. I'm game to start wherever you want. Do you want to start maybe with the DREAM Act, just because that was the thing in the news most recently?
That sounds fine. I think, why don't I lead off, because I think one of the things that gets missed in all of this, the headlines, is what one of the problems with regards to our current immigration law is. And that is that, from my perspective, that there is a whole generation of kids here in the United States that have been educated in the U.S. who speak English as their first language and who are totally acculturated, but don't have papers because they were brought here by their parents at very young ages. And so these kids have totally integrated into our society, but become really stateless persons once they graduate from high school and want to go on. That's the problem from my perspective. And the DREAM Act is an effort to solve that problem by giving kids a chance to earn a path to permanent residence and citizenship through service and through education.
I actually acknowledge the problem here. Clearly, these illegal immigrant kids brought here by their parents are the most sympathetic group of illegal immigrants. There's no disputing that. My concern, really, though, is with the DREAM Act itself. In other words, the legislation really isn't tailored to fix the problem of children brought here at a young age who have grown up as Americans. Rather, it's really more a kind of a prop poster child, if you will, for a larger amnesty. And if the goal was to fix the problem that you really identified.
It's pretty targeted to kids who were brought here before the age of 16, who complete high school, who then do either 2 years of college or military service. It's totally focused on those kids. How is it not targeted to those kids?
No, I agree. My point politically is...
Oh, the politics of it.
Yeah, I'll get to the substance and the politics of it. The politics of it, the reason it hasn't actually made progress by being, amended, tightened up, in my opinion, and improved, is because the supporters of it, at least in Washington, have no intention of seeing it move on its own, but rather use it as a kind of advertisement for a larger amnesty. But
some people do. Some people do. I know I've done Hill visits where some offices say they think it should be in the context of comprehensive reform, that to only fix one part of a broken system doesn't really solve everything. And you're right, it doesn't solve everything. But I think some of that resistance to working at these pieces of the problem kind of changed in the last couple of weeks, with an effort to make a move. That was sincere, at least from our part, it was sincere to make that move.
No, I agree. And I think the reason, frankly, is that a lot of the groups pushing for amnesty realized they weren't going to get anything else, and so they wanted one slice instead.
Do you really think, amnesty is a great buzzword, and that's the great thing that gets everybody's hackles raised and outraged. But amnesty just assumes, that means wipe the slate clean, it's just over and done with like it never happened. And that is not what any of the proposals out there do. And while you can continue to use the language of amnesty, it really is counterproductive if we want to work at governance of solving problems that our government is facing. So, why do you persist in using that word, other than its buzz factor?
The reason, I actually don't use it as an epithet. It's simply the descriptive word. It's the supporters of amnesty who have tried to redefine.
How do you define amnesty? How do you define it?
Amnesty in the immigration context, and this is true in every country of the world. There's a whole body of academic literature about amnesty. It means illegal immigrants get to stay. Anything that permits illegal immigrants to stay is by definition an immigration amnesty.
You're changing the definition then to say...
But that's how it's...
amnesty is erase the past. This does not erase the past.
It's like a
Okay, well, we can argue
parking.
semantics.
I mean, I don't want it, but the point is, it's like a parking ticket amnesty or a
Parking ticket amnesty.
well, no, they call it. You get an amnesty for tax, say unpaid taxes. What you do is you have to get right with the law by paying your back taxes or paying your tickets, but you don't pay the extra penalty, interest, etc., that you would have accrued without the amnesty. So in a sense, letting illegal immigrants stay is even more than an amnesty, because not only does it
that's great
eliminate,
rhetoric. That's great rhetoric.
but let's get back to the substance of the DREAM Act. I think there's some important points here.
Okay.
Legalizing the kids who were brought here at a young age, and frankly, this is one of the problems, is that 16 is simply too old. I mean, there are kids coming at that age who are coming on their own to hang drywall. When people think of the DREAM Act, and in fact, when the DREAM Act advocates...
Would you support a DREAM Act with, say, 14? The age of 14?
There are a couple of things here. First of all, something like that, yes, younger age. I would probably say something more like 10 or 12. The point is that they actually developed as people here. The year you could play with, but there's two holes, two absences, in my opinion, in the DREAM Act. One is that it's addressing a problem of illegal immigrant children brought here by their parents. Well, to make sure you don't have another DREAM Act 10 years from now, it seems to me you need to have measures that make it less likely that parents are going to do this. So you need enforcement measures,
which we certainly have in abundance.
Mandatory e-verify as part of DREAM Act 2.0. And the other thing...
Oh, I see. You want to incorporate e-verify into a DREAM Act. What about just dealing with the comprehensive problem that our government has? I mean, you're arguing against doing comprehensive reform, but on the other hand, you want to put in all the pieces of comprehensive reform. So... Because the question where do we go?
What is the problem? And seems to me, the most pressing problem, both in a practical sense and, frankly, I'll admit, in a moral sense, is these children who didn't break the immigration law because they were legally incapable of committing the criminal act of crossing the border and all of the rest of it.
Intentionality is not possible. Right.
That's my point. They didn't commit violations of the law. And since they've grown up here, it seems to me that actually is the chief problem with the chief illegal immigrant group that sort of calls for our action. And the things we need to do, like I said, number one, you try to take steps to prevent future children from being put in this position by their parents who are breaking the law. And secondly, make sure no adult who did this to their children is ever able to benefit from the legal status that their children get. And there are things you can do there, eliminate the parents category in legal immigration, or at least prevent those parents from ever being able to apply for legal status. Something like a package like that, a DREAM Act 2.0, is something that, frankly, if I were in Congress, I might even be able to.
I think the part that you miss when you start down the road of the punitive response to parents is the issue of our communities are best when families are together. We know that people acculturate most quickly when they have their families here. We know that English is learned most quickly by all immigrants, my grandparents included, when they had kids in school. And so by doing a punitive piece against parents, you're really doing an anti-family, anti-community approach for the sake of a purist message. I really think that what we need to look at is the comprehensive reform, because our country does have a serious problem, I think you agree, in that we don't know who's here. And we should be able to know who's in our country. We should have a registry of who's here and who leaves. And that we don't have. So I think you would agree that would be a good thing to have. And that if deportation is going to be the price for registering, then we drive people further away from registering and knowing who's in our country. So I'm not sure we get a lot by being really punitive to folks when we have an interest in knowing who's in our country. Don't you agree?
My concern, though, and this is the concern of most critics of legalization, is that what the supporters of so-called comprehensive immigration reform want will not solve any problem other than the lack of legal status for the illegal immigrants. In other words, 10 years from now, we'll have another 10 million illegal immigrants.
Unless we seriously deal with what they call the issue of future flow. How do folks come in, and what are the needs in our country, both economic and familial, and making a realistic immigration law for the 21st century? I'd agree with you. The problem.
But see, that's the part of this so-called comprehensive package that doesn't get talked about. It's not really a two-part thing.
Oh, it's at least 3 or 4.
Legalization in exchange for enforcement. It's actually 3 parts: legalization, enforcement, and very large increases over the current high levels of legal immigration. And
actually, you can use high levels, but proportionately, they're not that high. And I think the new proposal that Senator Menendez submitted last week was a step towards trying to have this conversation, because it really is, I think, the toughest piece of immigration, which is how do we define future flow? Because it's very clear that we've got economic needs, we have needs for certain types of employment, and that employment is not just the high-tech employment that we have a tendency to think of. We have a lot of low-wage workers, or unskilled workers that do all sorts of jobs in our country, even in this economy, that we've got to deal with realistically. And then we also need to deal with what about family unification, and how do we address that? So I think let's have a conversation of that, because our economy needs us to solve this problem. And if we don't solve this problem, we're going to end up stagnant like Japan, who basically has an aging population, no new workers, and it is immigrants that are keeping us young. So we have a real interest in solving this problem.
Actually, we've run the numbers, and immigrants have a very small effect on the average age of the population, even at very high levels of immigration, because our population is already so large.
But if you look at birth rates, look at birth rates. That is a different issue.
We have looked at birth rates, and without any immigrants over the past 20 years, the fertility rate, the birth rate of the native-born, is actually only about 1/10 of a point less than it is now. It's just we have such a large base of our population, and native-born Americans, frankly, have kids at higher rates than any other developed society, that the kind of argument you're making about demography and birth rates and aging is relevant to smaller societies with much lower birth rates, like Japan, like Korea, like, frankly, China even. China has a much lower birth rate than native Americans.
China's got a lot of trouble, so let's not talk about that one on this
No, I understand. But Western Europe and what have you, but those kind of concerns, demographic concerns, simply don't apply to us. They just
That's
don't.
nice, you can dismiss them. That's not the data I have, and we could swap data. But I think the point is the economy requires it, and we need it.
I would dispute that, but I want to dispute that, but let me address the political obstacle, I think, that the so-called comprehensive people have to face, and that is that the public simply doesn't trust promises of future enforcement. In 1986, that was the deal that, we'll legalize the illegal immigrants, tie up the loose ends of past policy mistakes, but we're going to have, tough enforcement in the future. And the obvious, logic, the way that kind of thing works out, is that the illegal immigrants got their legal status up front, and then the promises of amnesty, of enforcement rather, were abandoned, even if the people who made those promises were sincere about them, and maybe they were. Some of them were lying. Some of them really did intend to carry through on those promises. But frankly, once the legalization happened, the interest in actually pursuing that enforcement simply evaporated.
Well, that's an interesting point. I practiced law. I did immigration law at the time of the legalization program, and And I know that there was a big push for the legalization process, and it made a significant difference. There was an initial push at enforcement, as I recall, back in the 80s when it first passed, but it did wane. We also have to put into the equation the shift in the trade agreements, especially NAFTA, which created a great disequilibrium in the rural Mexico, which had fueled a lot of the movement to first to Mexico's cities and then to the U.S. One of the challenges we're facing as a nation in this score is that there are thousands of treaties for the free movement of goods and capital. The only one that exists that I know of is the UNHCR for the movement of people. And we know free market works on movement of capital, movement of labor. And since we don't have any system for the movement of labor to where the jobs are, I think it becomes a real economic enforcement in this setting becomes a real economic constraint, or else there's great exploitation. So I think we've got the economy argument has some real concerns that we really need to figure out how to solve this problem.
It's really, I've been struck how the left has really adopted the economic arguments of capital when it comes to open immigration. I mean, this
well,
is
maybe
the kind
we
of thing
acknowledge that that's the dominant message.
The Cato Institute could have made this, or in fact does make this exact argument. And I
So you're surprised at my argument?
I have to differ, quite honestly,
really?
Because there's a couple of things. First of all, practically speaking, if we're going to talk about Mexico, for instance, and NAFTA and what have you, the sort of the flight of people from the land in Mexico was simply going to happen anyway. NAFTA may have accelerated it, but that's a natural process of development that's happened everywhere in the world because there's excess farmers. As technology advances, you don't need as many farmers. They leave, they go to the cities. The problem with NAFTA, as far as I'm concerned, is not that it happened, but rather that it wasn't accompanied by very strict immigration controls. NAFTA is actually an argument for tougher immigration controls.
That's interesting.
So that those people leaving the land will be funneled into Mexico's own cities instead of what happened, which is a very large share of them came to our cities. NAFTA only passed politically because it was sold as an immigration control measure. I mean, literally, it's the only reason there were sufficient Republican votes to pass it. And the problem is that whatever
I
you
thought
think
there was a lot of economic arguments that also underscored.
There were all kinds of arguments, but what pushed it over the top, remember, it was Republicans in Congress who passed it.
Right.
Clinton was for it, Democrats were against it. They got the margin of victory because they were told this was an immigration control measure. And in fact, it's an immigration acceleration measure if it's not accompanied by tough border controls.
See, but border controls don't make a difference. This is the problem.
Well, immigration controls.
This is the problem. Wait. Border control is we've got 600 miles of fence, and we still have trouble because we got to fix the law. The law is not working. That's the problem.
You're right, it is, and that is because employers can hire illegal immigrants with impunity. It's because
I don't know about impunity, but there's a greater likelihood. Day laborers certainly is a big problem, and it seems like left and right seem to hire day laborers without concern for...
Well, day laborers are actually a tiny share of the immigrant workforce. Most illegal immigrants, something like 60% work on the books.
That's true.
They have, stolen or fake Social Security numbers.
Or got them when they had status. Yeah. Or got them when they had legal status, because most of the folks that have overstayed...
some of them had status, and yes, but they're using them fraudulently because they're now working illegally. Or, frankly, in most cases, though, they acquired or borrowed or stole the information.
Yeah, and I don't know that that's a fact, but
the IRS and the Social Security Administration take no real steps to prevent this kind of widespread fraud. The Immigration Service now is essentially no longer prosecuting employers or illegal employees for illegal
That's not my understanding. I understand that employer prosecution is continuing. What stopped were the workplace raids.
Employer prosecutions are way down because if you're not arresting illegal immigrants, you don't have anybody who will then provide information and testify against the employers. So this idea of the current administration to only do these audits of personnel records, and audits are a good idea, but because they're not also doing arrests, they can't get information that can lead to prosecutions, so employer prosecutions are way down. My only point broadly there is that you can't say that the system is broken, which is sort of this hackneyed cliche of the other side, when in fact we're not even serious about enforcing the existing immigration laws that are within our power to enforce.
But isn't the problem that there is still a need in our country for these workers? That's the problem.
No, it isn't.
It's
there's
not.
no. The economy does not have any.
So you're going to take Stephen Colbert's, join Stephen Colbert in the field and pick?
The point to, that's a great example actually, farm labor. In the 1950s and early 60s, we had a big guest worker program.
I know. I lived in California.
Right.
Keenly
it was called the
aware.
Bracero program.
Right.
Mexican men were imported to work on, only men, and they were imported to work on farms in the Southwest.
With a fair amount of
very
exploitation.
exploitative.
Yes. Yeah.
Say it again?
A lot of exploitation.
Yes, that's what I'm saying. It was a very exploitative, terrible program. It was ended by Congress as kind of a civil rights measure, part of the other civil rights legislation. The farmers at the time said exactly what you were saying. They said, our industry will disappear, the whole usual thing. What happened, though, is that illegal immigration took a good 10, 15 years to make up that gap. And during that 10 or 15 years, agricultural mechanization exploded, and it came to a halt once illegal immigration was permitted to grow enough that farmers no longer had the incentive, the economic incentive, to invest and deploy machinery. That's the solution.
I
it's
think
not
that's
Stephen
overstating.
Colbert
That's
picking corn.
overstating. That's certainly overstating mechanization, because at least my experience as a Californian, though I don't live there now, my experience is that there's a high level of mechanization, and that if anything, mechanization sort of topped out, that you can tweak so much with your machines.
No.
But most of California agriculture is mechanized. So
it's large part depends on the crop.
well, there is that.
Like
Picking
nuts,
some tomatoes are challenging.
tree nuts, for instance, the nuts on trees like almonds and things, completely mechanized.
Right.
No one ever touches those by hand until you open the bag up and eat them.
Right.
But all kinds of other things that should be mechanized, that can be mechanized, aren't. For instance, lettuce. There are lettuce harvesters. There are companies that sell them. But when labor is cheap enough, then farmers don't have the incentive to buy this lettuce harvesting machine, to develop and plant varieties of lettuce
So are you
that are more
opposed to
compatible.
competition with the machines? I mean,
Say it again?
labor, if labor is cheap enough, then it's competing with machines. And shouldn't that
Right,
drive,
exactly.
drive machine prices down? And shouldn't that be good for a free
No,
market
because
here?
there's a good deal of research and investment and deployment that's necessary to kind of get over that hump from stoop labor to machine.
So you're saying these
costs.
machines could exist, but they don't exist. Is that right?
They do. Let me just give you one quick example. Fresno, California, within 50 miles is where all raisins in the Western
Yes,
Hemisphere
it's
are
the
grown,
raisin
pretty much.
capital. Yes.
In 50 years ago in Australia, they came up, because the climate in parts of Australia is similar, they came up with a way of harvesting raisins with much less labor. It's technical, it doesn't matter, but you cut the stem instead of each bunch of raisins. Because now raisins are harvested in Fresno basically like it was ancient Greece. I mean, literally, somebody from ancient Greece could go to Fresno and they would understand the raisin business. The problem is, the reason that new technology didn't spread from Australia, and only very slowly, is because the labor is so cheap in Australia. I mean, in Fresno, why would they invest in mechanization? As it's gotten harder to get illegal immigrants, slowly, at a snail's pace, this mechanization is spreading. I think we have a clear interest in having that mechanization spread faster.
Why? Because isn't that creating greater oil dependence and a greater...
Machines don't create welfare costs. They don't change your society.
And
they're just
machines
things.
don't
They're
pay
just things.
Social Security, and machines don't contribute to a community, and machines don't participate in a democracy. So, I don't
But
know.
the
We
point
can
is-
argue machines are people. I'll vote for people most times. But I'm prejudiced. I am a person, so.
That we're importing people into our society that we don't need to have. That's the point. You're saying it's essential. I'm saying it's not essential. It's completely optional. And it's an option that elites are comfortable with, but that the public broadly simply doesn't like.
Oh, my glory. You know, I was in, where was I? Nebraska, and you talk about elites. And I was out in rural Nebraska, and we were at a school function, and a large percentage of the parents that were at this school function were Hispanic descent. A large were, I think they told me, were the German crowd, and some of the Norwegians. I was surprised. I didn't know Nebraska had Norwegians. And it was quite a mixed group, but it was one community. So the Hispanic folks were mostly newer immigrants. I don't know how long they'd been here, but many had a clear Spanish Mexican accent, and but that was one community. So I don't know who you would vote off the island out of that community. They were agricultural workers working the land together and had quite a collaborative approach to making agriculture work in our country. So I don't know. I mean, you could talk machines or people. I still would vote for people.
The question is not who gets voted off the island. The question is, as Americans, the policy of the United States, the goal of it, has to be to promote the well-being of the native-born people and the naturalized citizens of that society. In other words, it is the chief and I would say overwhelming responsibility of the state to look after the interests of the citizens, the members of that society. And the question is the importation of low-skilled labor from abroad in the interests of American citizens? And it just isn't. It's in the interest of employers, and it's in the interest of the immigrants.
Aren't employers citizens?
Sure they are. They're one faction of citizens.
Okay, so it's in their interest.
It's clearly contrary to the interests of those who are not owners of capital, those who are not employers, and those who are not wealthy.
But you've already argued that it helps keep our food prices down, so isn't that in everybody's interest?
I have not argued that. It actually does not keep food prices down.
I thought you were saying that labor was so cheap, and therefore the consequence is then the cost is less, right?
A little bit, but when you look at
it, you can't have it both ways.
No, yes, I can. Yes, I can. Because look, let me explain why. Ag economist at UC Davis has calculated.
Oh, glory, my alma mater. Thank you very much. Yes.
That if every farm worker got a 40% raise tomorrow, which is what Cesar Chavez had been pushing for years ago, the average cost per year for the average family of paying for fruits and vegetables would be what? It wouldn't be $800 more. It wouldn't be $80 more. It would be $8 a year more. And the extra social service cost that $8 of cheaper vegetables is completely swamps that $8 savings.
Why don't we? I agree we should legislate. We should get folks into the system who are acculturated and here, and we should get them paying taxes so that if they got $8 more, great. Let's get them into the system paying their taxes. I think that would be a real step forward. And I want to know who's in our country. So
most illegal immigrants are paying taxes. In fact, first of all, most of them are working on the books. And even the ones who aren't working on the books are paying sales taxes. They're paying the property taxes through their rent. They're paying taxes. The point is that even
so, they're contributing to our society, but getting no benefits.
But because they're low skilled, they consume far more in government services than they can ever pay in taxes, whether they're legal or illegal.
Okay, we can, again, here's swapping data. There's a variety of data on that, and there's a bunch of data that says that's not true.
Actually, there's no serious economist who says that a person without a high school degree can pay more in taxes than he uses in services. It's simply impossible. It can't happen in a modern society. Now, that's not all people are, obviously. There are reasons we have a social safety net and a public school system and all the rest of it.
Do you think the public school system is a social safety net? It's not a... Oh, that's interesting.
It's a government service supported by taxpayers, a kind of thing that didn't exist.
In our future, yes.
A kind of thing that didn't exist 100 years ago. And so if you imported someone with a third-grade education a century ago, it didn't have much effect on taxpayers because there wasn't much in the way of government services to pay for. In a modern society, we have not just a welfare state, but a very large government sector supported by tax payments. And the average family of four, headed by a high school dropout, uses almost $20,000 more in government services than they pay in taxes. It's not a moral failing. It's just the way it is in a modern society. And the question is, do we want more and more people who are going to inevitably use more in government services? And
I don't believe there's any evidence of the inevitability of all that you're saying. And I think maybe we ought to return back to immigration. Is it possible to have a 21st century immigration policy that would acknowledge the enculturation of folks into our society? Most of the folks that have overstayed visas have been here who are currently called without current documents, have been here more than 5 years. At least 90% have been here more than 5 years. They're part of our society. Shouldn't we just acknowledge that? How do we create future flow for 21st century? We both agree that's the biggest challenge that we're facing. And then realistic enforcement. Because I think the challenge with enforcement is how much of our own liberty do we give up in order to protect ourselves from what's currently thought to be about 10.6 million people. So I think there's some trade-offs here that I'm not sure that I want to cage myself in order to make sure not one person gets across. Yet on the other hand, I want to know who's in our country. So,
but we have obviously very different visions of what a 21st century immigration policy should be.
Right, it sounds like you just want everybody out of here.
And frankly, what you're describing is a 19th century immigration policy.
Well, back to the future, maybe that's the deal.
In a modern society, there is no need for immigration. There's no economic.
Have you looked at the global reality? That globally everybody's on the move? Do you know that?
That's, first of all, the proportion of the world's population, which is ever likely to move outside the country of its birth, is minuscule. It's like 250 million total everywhere in the world out of 6 point something.
Not according to
so
the
number
UN,
one,
it's
very small.
It's not
on global
small.
scale. It's small. Number two,
that's because China's got a few limitations on movement, and they've got a big bunch of people.
They got limitations on internal movement, but there are people moving all over China, and it's not that hard to leave China. Actually, it's not North Korea.
Sorry. Well, by comparison, you're right. But the issue is, this is not just a national issue; it's a global issue. And until we address the global reality, whenever there's going to be hunger and hope combined, people are going to move. That's how my relatives got here. My grandparents came because they were hungry and they had hope of an improvement. So as long as we've got global television that's going to spread hope and people are hungry, then movement's going to happen. And that's part of the 21st century that I think you're not really acknowledging. And to dismiss it as just a small, minuscule amount really doesn't look at all. I mean, just Mexico, the huge movement of population within Mexico and outside of Mexico. I mean, you're just flying in the face of reality. So my reality is quite different from yours. So I don't know how we ever solve this trouble.
I mean, what you're arguing is a kind of fatalism that there's nothing we can do about. There's nothing we can do about.
We can create an organization. We can set up a real system that deals with the real push factors as well as the pull factors. We can address the economic realities that are here, create a real worker program that works, where workers can maintain their visas and that there is not exploitation, that we have a realistic process for both folks coming for family reunification and for enculturation. I believe people need to learn English, engage in our society, be a part of who we are. That's what makes us rich.
Understand though, what you're saying though is that we don't have any realistic way of actually limiting the number of people coming here. We might be able to put some requirements on it, channel it one way or the other, but we are helpless in the face of actual numbers of people. So that future flow discussion really amounts to simply acknowledging people are going to come here, there's nothing we can do about it, so let's at least label them as legal arrivals because we can't stop them no matter what. And that kind of fatalism is, I would say, fundamentally anti-democratic almost, in that the American people don't have control over who is going to, or don't have the ability to limit who's going to move.
Well, that's interesting. That's interesting because, the 18th or the 19th century immigration really was that wide open free form where a lot of our ancestors got here. But I think that if we...
And the oceans are what limited immigration then. Technology limited it. Now that technological obstacle doesn't exist, and therefore the state has to limit it because technology doesn't.
Oh, no, that's an interesting argument.
In other words, it was hard to get here. It was expensive. It
well,
was
it's
slow.
still expensive. It's not so slow if you come on a plane.
Not comparatively. It's not that expensive.
You still have to leave everything, and that
we
is
have
a
ordinary
huge
folks
issue.
From the Dominican Republic flying back and forth between New York and the DR, essentially living in two countries at the same time. You see the same thing with regard to Mexico and Central America. Now, this is a good thing. I mean, cheap airfare, cheap transportation, communications, these are all, boons of modernity. They're good things. But they make immigration much more problematic because the process that your grandparents and my grandparents underwent, which was refocusing their psychological attachments and their emotional connections from one country to another, pulling their roots up, doesn't happen as quickly or as thoroughly or as completely
Aren't you
as it did in the past.
Aren't you arguing just the opposite? Do we have to go to the polar opposite? So you're saying that I'm just for open-ended immigration, and what I hear you saying is that you're for none at all. So
I'm for zero-based budgeting in immigration. Start at zero, and then decide which very narrowly defined groups of people have such a compelling case to be let in.
Selection, and who's going to be the decider? You get to be the decider, Mark. Is that
no, Congress does. The American people, through their elected representatives, do.
So everybody gets in on a special bill? This is my Aunt Molly, and she's really, really nice. She does great canning. She should come in.
We set objective standards. One, spouses
so did you like the 2007 point system? Did you like that system?
No, I don't like point systems. Honestly, I think they're
then
a real
how
problem.
Are you going to administer this?
That's a whole other. Well, I'll tell you. It's in the last chapter of my book. Spouses and minor children of U.S. citizens. There's a moral case and a practical case that they should continue to be admitted without numerical limitation, and they always have been, even when we shut immigration off in the 20s. But that's 400,000 people a year right off the bat. Secondly, a handful of real Einsteins, not just people with a college degree, but Einsteins. Again, like part of the EB1 category, which you know what I'm talking about, but it's the most selective category. And then a handful of real refugees who have nowhere else to go, will never have anywhere else to go, and are in immediate danger of their lives. When you add that up, you've got 450,000 people a year. That's a lot of immigration. It's just a lot less than we have now.
It doesn't match the economic need. It doesn't match family need. It ain't going to work, Oracle. And we can stay on our polls. We can stay on our polls, or we can try to find a way to come to the middle, which is to say, okay, you may have some points there in terms of criteria. Let's see what we can do that is realistic. I like the idea of a commission that looks at what is actually needed in our society at this point, and that they make some of those studied judgments. I think that's a good idea. That would be a good step forward towards dealing with future flow. It is a tough issue, but that's
comprehensivists came up with, is this commission idea of determining, essentially having bureaucrats set the immigration level. But even
wouldn't that be a help? I mean,
no,
doesn't that fit your criteria?
It's based on a fundamental fallacy that the economy needs a certain level of immigration. People use this analogy all the time, that a low level of immigration is like a 30-mile-an-hour speed limit on the interstate. Mm-hmm. And that resonates with people. The problem with the analogy is that the interstate is designed for 70-mile-an-hour traffic. The angle of the curves, the sight lines, the shoulders, the whole thing. The economy is not designed for any particular level of immigration. It could be low. It could be high.
Then neither one of us can be right.
What's that?
Neither one of us can be right then.
But there is no right. That's my point.
So then let's find a middle ground.
Right answer. There's no right answer to how much labor an economy needs. We decide it through non-economic decision-making and the economy adjusts.
That's interesting. So politics is going to be politics. Maybe that's where we have to leave it. We started politically. I guess maybe we
that's
have
what
to
democracy's about, I'm afraid.
It makes it exciting anyway.
It does. It's interesting.
Thanks for
So
that.
I think we're probably supposed to wrap it up now.
I think so. Thanks for this stimulating conversation, Mark.
I enjoyed it a lot. Thank you.
Thank you. Take care.
Okay. Bye now.
Bye.